Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the initial broadband data collection workshop for tribal governments. This workshop will provide information about the FCC's broadband data collection and the tools and processes that we are building to enable tribes to submit verified broadband availability data directly to the FCC. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Matthew Duchesne. I'm the Chief of the FCC's Office of Native Affairs and Policy. I'd like to introduce the FCC staff who are here today before I turn it over to Jean Cadieux, the chair of the FCC's Broadband Data Task Force, to talk a bit about the importance of the effort that is underway throughout the FCC and the topics that will be covered today. Our presenters will be Kirk Berge, Chief of Staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau, Sean Spivey, the Broadband Data Task Force Senior Counsel, Chelsea Fallon, its Senior Implementation Officer, and John Cobb, its Legal Advisor. We are also joined by Barbara Esbin, who is the Deputy Chief in the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau and who oversees the Office of Native Affairs and Policy as part of the FCC's Intergovernmental Relations. Also here, Sayuri Rajapaksa, who is the Deputy Chief of ONAP, and Janet Sievett, Lloyd Collier, and Derek Goetson, all legal advisors in ONAP. We have a full agenda for today's session, so let me turn it over to Jean.
Thanks, Matthew. The need for accurate data pinpointing where broadband service is available, and perhaps more importantly, where it's not available, has never been greater. Even before the global spread of COVID-19, broadband service had become a vital aspect of everyday life, and the pandemic has only magnified the disparities between those who have access to reliable internet connectivity and those who do not, as families have struggled with the realities of remote schooling, telework, and the shift to online operations and services. Efforts to remedy that digital divide have long been hampered by the lack of precise, granular data on the availability and quality of fixed and mobile broadband services, data that would enable resources to be targeted toward areas most in need. The FCC is committed to remedying that lack of reliable data and is busy developing our new broadband data collection systems and processes to more precisely determine broadband availability so that federal and state resources can be targeted to connect everyone, everywhere, to reliable, high-speed broadband service. Dedicated staff throughout the FCC are working as quickly as possible to build and test our new systems, but the success of our effort to finally be able to pinpoint the availability of broadband services on tribal lands will ultimately depend not only on our own efforts, but also on the participation of tribal leaders like all of you in our challenge and other verification processes. I therefore very much appreciate the time that you're taking to participate today so that we can tell you where that effort stands and how tribal entities will be able to help us to make sure that our maps showing broadband availability on tribal lands are as accurate and precise as possible. I hope that all of you will continue to work with us as we move forward on this critical effort, which will provide a foundation of precise and consistent broadband availability data that will be critical to federal and state efforts to target public funds to connect unserved and underserved communities. Today's workshop will cover two primary areas. First, we'll provide an overview of how the FCC is changing its methods and processes for collecting and publishing broadband deployment data nationwide, including on tribal lands pursuant to the Broadband Data Act. We'll then have time for some questions. Second, we will provide technical information about the processes for tribal governments to submit your own broadband data. Specifically, we will provide information regarding how the FCC system will authenticate tribal governmental entities when filing in the new broadband data collection system, and some general requirements and specifications for formatting and preparing broadband availability data. We will then have additional time reserved for questions on the technical assistance portion of the presentation. Finally, we'll provide some guidance on the next steps as the Commission prepares to launch the full broadband data collection, or as we call it, the BDC. Before we begin, however, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping matters. First, today's workshop will be recorded, and that recording, as well as the slides we'll use today for today's presentation, will be made available on the FCC's website following the workshop. Second, nothing discussed in this workshop or in the slides supersedes any provision of FCC rules, orders, or public notices. The workshop should not be used as a substitute for reviewing Commission orders, rules, and public notices regarding the broadband data collection. All the relevant FCC documents are available on the Broadband Data Collection webpage at www.fcc.gov/broadbanddata. Third, attending or asking questions as part of this workshop will not require a filing under the Commission's rules governing ex parte communications. However, please do not submit questions that contain comments directed to the merits or outcome of pending rulemakings, particularly the matters raised in the Mobile Challenge public notice released on July 16th, as those would require an ex parte filing. Finally, as I mentioned, we'll have two opportunities today for staff to respond to any questions you may have about the broadband data collection and the technical assistance topics we covered today. If you have questions, please submit them in the WebEx question and answer box at any time during the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to more important things with Kirk Bergia to get started on the background information.
Thank you, Jean, and good afternoon, everyone. As Jean mentioned, even before the global spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, access to broadband service had become more vital for school, work, healthcare, and more. But the first step to connecting all Americans is ensuring that we have accurate data about where broadband is and is not available across the country. The FCC is the independent federal agency responsible for implementing and enforcing America's communications law and regulations, and has been tasked with collecting, mapping, and making available more precise nationwide broadband data. So our historical approach to collecting deployment data, as many of you may be aware, was through the FCC Form 477 data collection. The current collection of broadband deployment data is on the fixed side is in the form of collecting information on census blocks that have deployment, and it's currently set up so that a fixed provider reports whether or not they have service in a given census block, and it doesn't go below that level of granularity. So there's currently 11 million, more than 11 million census blocks that vary in size between urban and rural areas. As indicated, if a provider makes service available to at least one location in the census block, then the entire census block is shown as served by the provider. As a result of this, we don't have a view below the census block level. It's not a granular view of deployment. We just know yes or no, does a census block have service reported in it? And this makes it difficult to allocate, for example, high cost funding efficiently. We only have a very basic level of information about deployment in a census block and have to make decisions based on that. It also, the census block level reporting also makes it more challenging to identify inaccuracies in the reported data. If a census block is shown as served, the only way to prove that it isn't served is to prove that there's no location within that census block that has service, which is a pretty difficult task. So we're limited right now on the fixed side, in particular with regard to our ability to understand the extent of deployment. Mobile providers on Form 477 currently report broadband deployment by technology and based on the minimum advertised speed, or if a particular speed is not advertised, then they report the speeds consumers should reasonably expect to receive at a given location. But there's no standardization of the reporting parameters across providers. They're given significant leeway to determine how to report their coverage, which makes it difficult for us and other stakeholders to do apples to apples comparisons among data from different mobile service providers. So recognizing these shortcomings, which the FCC and Congress have both recognized, and the need for more precise and consistent broadband availability data, in March of 2020, Congress directed the FCC to develop processes and procedures to collect, verify, and publish more precise data in the Broadband Deployment Accuracy and Technology Availability Act, or the Broadband Data Act. That act essentially aligned with actions the FCC was taking before that to address the issues that were seen in the Form 477. But the act made it established statutory requirements for many of those elements. It specified multiple steps for the FCC to take to improve the broadband deployment data collected in the first instance, as well as measures to verify it after it's filed with us. In order to get the better data coming in, the Broadband Data Act required us to implement requirements on the fixed broadband reporting side to collect information about specific location deployment. In other words, we're moving below the census block level to a very high level of granularity that will be enable us to see where services reported location by location. Also in the Broadband Data Act, the Congress required that we establish what's called the Broadband Serviceable Locations Fabric, which is a database that we're required to establish that contains every location in the nationwide that could be served by broadband. That is, those that already are, or that those that could be are set out in the Broadband Locations Fabric. The Broadband Data Act also required that we establish standardized technical parameters for mobile providers to report, thereby addressing the issue of the lack of consistency across methodologies for reporting mobile service. The Broadband Data Act also required that we establish processes to improve the data that we receive. So one of those is through a challenge process, both for fixed and mobile services, as well as to the Broadband Serviceable Locations Fabric. We also were required to establish a process for collecting crowdsourced data, that is information from various stakeholders in the public and elsewhere to give us information and insight into the data that we're receiving from providers. The Broadband Data Act also required that we establish regular audit processes and an enhanced enforcement standard. It gave us an enhanced enforcement standard for misreported data. So we were given in the Broadband Data Act several different tools to improve the data collection at various points in the process. So the Broadband Data Act, after it was enacted in March of 2020, we began the process of implementing the requirements in the Act, and in July of 2020, the Commission adopted the second report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking in the Broadband Data Collection Docket, WC 19195. That second report and order established reporting requirements for fixed and mobile broadband deployment in the broadband data collection. It adopted the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric as an element of the broadband data collection, and adopted processes for verifying the data that we collect. Importantly, in December of last year, Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which appropriated funding for the FCC to implement and administer the multiple elements of the broadband data collection. So that was the money that was set aside or appropriated specifically for the purpose of the Commission developing the complex and various elements of the broadband data collection. In January of this year, the Commission adopted a third report and order in the broadband data collection docket, which made further refinements to the collection and established rules for the challenge processes. It delegated additional technical challenge and verification methodologies to the bureaus and offices for development. It established the requirements for the collection and submission of verified coverage data from governmental mapping entities, including tribal governmental entities. And it directed the Office of Economics and Analytics and our Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau to provide technical assistance to tribes and other interested parties. In February of this year, Chairwoman Rosenworcel established the Broadband Data Task Force led by Jean to expedite and coordinate the broadband data collection implementation effort that spans multiple FCC bureaus and offices. So it was a unified effort to unify the multiple different parties within the FCC that were responsible for developing the broadband data collection. So this slide shows the overall data flows and structure for the broadband data collection. You can see on the left are the data sources that will come into the FCC and will be used to develop the broadband deployment maps that the collection is intended to facilitate. These data inputs include provider data, so what the data that we currently get in a different form on the Form 477 from filers will now come in through the broadband data collection, subject to the new requirements. We'll receive local government data, either in the form of verified coverage data or through the other processes set up for stakeholder input. Tribal government data and federal government data will also come in through the same processes. And there's an avenue through which third parties who engage in mapping efforts can submit broadband data subject to certain criteria. We'll also collect public data through multiple avenues, including the challenge processes and the crowdsource processes, so that the data, there's an opportunity on the part of stakeholders who have firsthand knowledge of the state of deployment to provide us with information about that may supplement or contradict information that the filers submit to us. In the middle part of the diagram, you can see this is where we come in. We take the data in, we complete various processes to verify it and ensure it's of adequate quality. And some of this process will feed back to the data input that we receive in the first instance, so that those data, as these processes play out, the data will improve when we receive them in the first instance. So we'll validate data. There'll be feedback to providers. We'll be providing technical assistance to filers and challengers so that they're able to participate effectively in the collection. And we'll be conducting audits to identify areas where the provider data are not accurate, and making sure that they, on a going forward basis, their accuracy is increased. So on the right, you can see the outputs that we'll get from the new collection. And these include improved public maps. So we currently have broadband deployment maps that are based on the Form 477 data. The maps that we will create with the broadband data collection will be much improved. It will be publicly available for interested parties to evaluate the extent of deployment on a highly granular level. We'll also have available to us more useful data and more precise data for targeting universal service funding, making sure that the dollars go where they should go and not to other locations that may not need that support. And we'll get better data for our own reports and analyses that we conduct as we have done for many years. So what will we achieve in the new collection? We will have an unprecedented set of tools that will help us understand and report on broadband deployment. We'll get fixed broadband availability data down to the individual location. So this is a dramatic improvement on the granularity as compared to the current Form 477. We'll get mobile broadband availability data standardized across all providers so that we can compare much more readily the different data sets that we get from different providers of mobile coverage. We'll have a challenge process, or challenge processes, I should say, to identify and dispute the data collected from the providers. We'll be able to incorporate data from state, local, and tribal governments into the maps to further enhance their accuracy and usefulness. We'll get crowdsourced data to support our verification efforts. And as I mentioned, we'll have an audit process along with an enhanced enforcement standard, so that we'll be able to, at each stage of the collection, be able to improve the data as it goes along. And we expect that it will continually improve as we carry out these processes. So the the broadband data collection requires the establishment of multiple complex regulatory and IT systems, and we've made a lot of progress already on that. In the spring of this year, we entered into a data architect and design services contract for the IT systems that will make up the broadband data collection. We released a request for information for the broadband serviceable locations fabric, and we stood up a consumer experience portal to enable consumers to submit their real world information about their experiences with broadband deployment. This summer, we released a request for proposals for the fabric development. We entered into a contract for the IT system deployment, development, released a public notice on the mobile challenge verification and crowdsource methodology, and we collected and published 4G LTE mobile maps from the 4 largest cellular providers based on the broadband data collection parameters. So the new standardized parameters were applied by the 4 largest carriers to their data so that we could get an early view of what those new parameters will look like as they're reported into the broadband data collection. This was done in the context of the Form 477 process, but it used the same the standards that we'll be employing in the broadband data collection. So coming up in the fall and winter, we'll make modifications to the contract for the Fcc Speed Test App that will enable the mobile challenge and crowdsource updates. We will continue to work through the procurement process for the broadband serviceable locations fabric so that we can get the first version of the fabric available to the public as soon as possible. We'll enter into contracts for expanded technical assistance resources. And with this initial presentation today, we begin the process of providing technical assistance to stakeholders to enable them to participate in the broadband data collection. This will be the first of a number of efforts that we will be conducting to make sure that all of the parties who are involved in the broadband data collection can participate effectively. We'll also do the following to produce the new data. We'll conduct additional outreach to tribes and other filers. We'll enter into other contracts such as user acceptance contracts. We will release a public notice that will announce the start of the data collection, the initial filing window, and which will be followed by an initial data collection, and then after we've processed the data, an initial map publication. We'll, as part of that public notice, open the submission window, and we'll work with filers as they engage with the new system. So in addition to the formal technical assistance that we contemplate, we'll be engaging on an ongoing basis with stakeholders, including filers, to make sure that they are, as the process begins and continues, that they're able to engage with it effectively. We'll process the data and then publish the maps. And then the challenge and the verification processes will commence. The opportunity for stakeholders to weigh in on the provider data will commence after that initial collection and processing of the data, and then the publication of the maps. And I will turn it back to Jean.
Thanks, Kirk. At this point, we're going to pause to see if there are questions that we have from the audience. We had a couple of questions in advance of the webinar today that I think my colleague John Cobb, our task force legal advisor, can help direct for us. John?
Absolutely. So I think our first question, I'll turn it to Kirk. So I know that this is a question we hear very often about what other information the FCC might be collecting on broadband. I know there's a lot of interest on price and affordability. So I know that's something that comes up frequently. So Kirk, if you want to talk about what this is going to focus on.
Yeah, well, the Broadband Data Act, as I went through, it is focused on deployment. And right now we are directing our efforts at carrying out the requirements of the Broadband Data Act, which do not include pricing information or other information currently. It's not to say that it's not something we won't do down the line, but we're working to get the collection up and running, and so that the initial core data set can be made available as quickly as possible.
Great. This is a question that I know Kirk already touched on this, but if Sean wants to, this will be for Sean, about what steps the FCC is going to be taking to ensure the reliability and accuracy of the data we're collecting. That's obviously the whole point of this effort, but I know it's something that comes up again and again as well. Sean?
Sure. Thanks, John. So the BDC is going to incorporate a number of different processes to ensure that the data that we collect is more granular and more standardized at the outset, and so that we can improve the accuracy of the data that the ISP, that the service providers submit over time, based on things like on the ground speed testing. So, for example, the internet service providers, when they submit their data, they are going to have to include certain certifications, both from a corporate officer as well as an engineering certification, basically attesting that, to the best of the filer's knowledge, and information and belief, that the data submitted is consistent, is true, accurate, and consistent with their network modeling, in the case of mobile service providers, for example, that it's kind of prepared in the ordinary course of business. As we are building out the broadband data collection system, we are looking at ways to include automated validation so that when data comes into our systems, very quickly we can kind of check to see if anything is askew, and at a minimum that it kind of meets the data specifications that we require for the data to be in, so that it can be ingested into the system, and in the case of fixed data, overlaid onto our broadband serviceable location fabric. We are also, as I believe Kirk mentioned during his presentation, we have a number of tools available at our disposal under the Broadband Data Act, including verification inquiries that staff can launch based on a credible basis after reviewing the data. If we see something that we think merits further inquiry with the broadband service provider, we can do verification into discrete areas to make sure that the data submitted is accurate, as well as auditing processes. We can do random audits at times that will also help kind of ensure data quality and validity. And that's in addition to the challenge process that we have stood up, which is really going to be a key critical component of all of this. There's only so many resources that can be brought to bear by commission staff. We are really going to be looking to outside parties, whether it be consumers, state, local, tribal governmental entities, other broadband service providers, to review the data that we are making publicly available, and where appropriate, submit challenges to that data where they think it's inaccurate, and as well as us reviewing crowdsourced data that maybe doesn't meet kind of the heightened threshold of challenge data that we're establishing, but nonetheless may prove informative as we kind of do our verifications and other checks and balances that are built into the system overall.
Great. Thanks so much, Sean. I'm going to transition something that Sean brought up that I know there's a lot of interest in, generally is speed test data. And I know we've received a question about about parameters for speed test data and the way that they can be manipulated, I guess, for lack of a better word. So I wonder if we wanted to address generally how we're planning to use speed test data. If Kirk wants to talk about that, and then maybe Chelsea can jump in on some of those other aspects of it.
Sure. So the speed test data will have an integral role in the mobile deployment picture. It'll be used to both verify and challenge provider data. Using the Fcc Speed Test App or another approved third-party speed test app, consumers will be able to test the performance of their mobile broadband networks and provide the test results to the FCC while protecting the privacy and confidentiality of the users. The FCC recently executed a contract modification with the Speed Test App developer to update the app so that it can be used in the future as a platform for consumers to submit challenges to provider-submitted mobile broadband data maps. On the fixed side, it's a different picture. The speed test results do not get to the heart of what our broadband data collection program will collect for fixed broadband deployment. That is, whether broadband service is or is not offered in a particular location, and if it's offered, the maximum available speed at which the service is offered. Some of the things that can affect that for in a speed test on the fixed side is that the subscribers may not be subscribing to the highest speed offered. And other factors can affect, other factors outside of providers' control may skew speed test results on fixed broadband connections. So it's not a good indicator necessarily of what services are available at a specific location for fixed services. So the FCC determined that speed test data will not be used as the basis for a challenge to the fixed service map.
I think that covers most of the points. I think I'll be in my part of the presentation, I'll be getting into more about the data that we're collecting that will kind of form the foundation and give a little more context for how the speed data and other challenge data will, what those will be challenging.
Great. I know that there was a question early on about whether or not this session will be recorded. I'm just gonna reiterate for everyone that we are recording this session, and we will post the recording as well as the slides on our website at www.fcc.gov/broadband data. We also seem to have gotten a question about timing, so I'm going to kick that one to Jean, because I think that is the many million-dollar question that everyone always wants to talk about.
That you might imagine, we get that question quite often. We have many work streams in motion across the Commission to make the new maps as available as quickly as we possibly can. And we're making great progress on the highly complex IT systems and platforms that we need to collect the data from both providers and state, local, and tribal governments, and to undertake an interactive, if you will, challenge process in order to verify and make sure our data that we are collecting is accurate. We're also finalizing data specifications and mobile challenge procedures, and we're working on updates to our Fcc Speed Test App for use in mobile challenges. Unfortunately, the timing for completing the fabric that we need to bring fixed availability down to the location level is likely to be a little bit delayed due to contracting issues, and then we're working on those and working them through. Therefore, the FCC will shortly open its next Form 477 data filing window, which starts with data as of December 31st, and the window opens January 1st. And then we'll be aiming at starting the new broadband data collection in the following filing window. But we're moving just as quickly as we possibly can.
Great. Thanks so much, Jean. Let's turn, I know this is an issue that comes up often. How are satellite providers going to be reporting their data in this collection, Kirk?
Satellite providers are subject to the same standards for availability reporting that apply to all fixed services providers. That is, they must identify the locations to which they can provide service, or are providing service, or could provide service within standard broadband installation, which means within 10 business days of a request and without charges associated with extending the network. So ordinary charges within a 10 business day interval. Satellite, that said, I mean, no fixed service provider can report an ability to service an area or location without a reasonable basis for doing so. So the Commission has noted that satellite providers must take into account the relevant factors, including their current and expected locations of their spot beams and capacity constraints associated with their systems when they make the determination. The Commission also said that it would rely on a variety of factors to ensure a better representation of satellite broadband availability, including crowdsourced data checks, certifications, audits, and enforcement. A lot of the tools that I mentioned during my presentation will be used to verify and check on the accuracy of satellite providers' reported deployment. The FCC also said that it would rely on subscriber data in assessing the accuracy of satellite broadband availability data. So the presence of actual subscribers is not a requirement for claiming deployment in an area. As I indicated, you can report deployment both where you are actually deployed and where you could connect a subscriber within 10 business days of a request. And the presence or absence of subscribers above a de minimis level in a census tract that encompasses locations reported as served by a satellite may provide a useful check. It may be the basis for further investigation to make sure that the deployment data are accurate.
Great. Thanks so much, Kirk. And then we got another question about the technical aspects of speed tests. I think we're going to get into some of those details in our technical discussion, so we'll circle back to that. We can circle back to that after. I see that there was a question about certifying engineers. Sean?
Sure. Thanks, John. So in the third report and order that the Commission adopted in January of this year, we stated that that we will require mobile and fixed service providers to submit certifications of the accuracy of its submissions by a qualified engineer. And as part of that, we said that the certification must state that the certified professional engineer or a corporate engineering officer, if a corporate officer also happens to be an engineer and they want to do one certification, but whoever is submitting the engineering certification must be employed by the service provider and have direct knowledge of or responsibility for the generation of the service provider's coverage maps. I don't think that we got to the level of specificity of whether employed by means that it must be a full-time employee versus a contractor. But the certifying engineer would need to have either direct knowledge of or responsibility for the preparation of the coverage maps. So I think, we realize that certain small service providers may not always have in-house engineering resources on the full-time payroll. So I think we were trying to accommodate that. And there was language also in that same report and order where the Commission declined a recommendation by at least one commenter in the record that the Commission require providers to employ a full-time engineer for the sole purpose of submitting the certifications. So I think that lends support to the proposition that there's a little bit of flexibility there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sean. We got a question about NTIA's grant applications that I'll pass to Jean.
Thanks, John. Yeah, the statute, I think, does envision that NTIA will make use of our broadband data collection maps as part of its grant program. So the two programs are intertwined, and that's one of the reasons why, as I mentioned, we're working as quickly as we can to get the data together that they'll need for that program. I think at this point, John, we should probably turn to the technical assistance part of today's program. And if you have additional questions concerning the information covered by Kirk, we can turn to those at the question and answer period at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sean Spivey, the Broadband Data Task Force Senior Counsel, to provide some more information about how tribal governments will submit broadband availability data. Sean?
Thanks, Jean. As just mentioned, my name is Sean Spivey. I'm Senior Counsel to the Broadband Data Task Force and Assistant Bureau Chief in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. Today's technical assistance workshop is going to focus on the submission of primary availability data by tribal governments, as opposed to challenge or crowdsourced data. Though I should mention that under our rules, this primary availability data may, in certain circumstances, feed into those challenge and crowdsourced processes as well. I'm going to be covering the first topic in today's technical assistance presentation, which is the process for tribal filers to authenticate their identity in the broadband data collection system when submitting verified data. The Broadband Data Act requires that the Commission develop a process to collect verified broadband availability data from state, local, and tribal governmental entities that are, quote, primarily responsible for mapping or tracking broadband internet access service coverage, unquote, in their respective jurisdictions. As I mentioned earlier, this process is distinct from and in addition to the challenge and crowdsource processes, which will collect other types of data that can be used to challenge and verify the primary availability data submitted by internet service providers. The Commission has adopted several rules and requirements for how it will implement this process. In July of 2020, in its second report and order in this proceeding, the Commission stated that it would treat verified availability data from governmental entities, quote unquote, on par with the availability data submitted by broadband service providers. It also sought comment on a number of aspects related to this collection, including how the Commission should interpret the phrase, quote, verified data, unquote, as used in the Broadband Data Act, and how to reconcile this data with the data submitted by service providers. The Commission directed the Wireline Competition Bureau, Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Office of Economics and Analytics, and Office of Engineering and Technology to develop the other details for the FCC's collection of these data. Subsequently, in the third report and order, the Commission said that it would consider data from governmental entities that, quote, bear certain indicia of credibility, unquote, to be verified for purposes of incorporating the data into the FCC's coverage maps. Specifically, the Commission said that it would evaluate the credibility of this type of data by analyzing the source of the data and the steps that the submitter took to gather and verify the data. The Commission noted that it would not accept data that a government filer collects directly from an internet service provider and passes along to the Commission without any attempt to verify that data. The Commission also determined that governmental entities submitting this type of data must file it in the same portal and under the same parameters that providers must use when submitting their primary availability data. We'll cover these data specifications in the second portion of today's technical assistance presentation. Once the Commission has determined that the data is in fact verified data, meeting the standards set forth in our rules, the data will be made publicly available as a layer on the coverage maps we are creating. The third report and order further determined that internet service providers will be required to review these verified data and make any corrections to their own coverage data they deem necessary within 60 days after being notified by our BDC system that the government entity has submitted data involving their service area. If, following this period of review by the service provider, the government entity does not agree with the provider's treatment of its data, then that governmental entity will have the option of filing its data as part of a challenge to the provider's availability data. There are two aspects to identity authentication we want to discuss today. The first topic we'd like to discuss is the system that the Commission will use to authenticate the identity of filers purporting to submit data on behalf of tribal governmental entities. We need a way to ensure that filers claiming to represent governmental agencies, including tribal governmental entities, are in fact acting on behalf of such organizations and have authorization and authority to submit data in the name of the governmental entity. We will be using the FCC's Commission Registration System, or CORS, to help us authenticate governmental entity filers. You may be familiar with the CORS system if you have done business with the FCC in the past. CORS is a system that assigns users a unique 10-digit FCC registration number, or FRN, to identify an entity's business dealings with the FCC. When registering for an FRN in CORS, CORS first asks the user to indicate whether the filer is an individual or a business. For the purpose of registering in CORS, state, local, and tribal governmental entities are considered business entities. Once selected, the user is taken to the domestic entity registration page shown on this slide to provide additional information in order to receive an FRN. Under the entity type field in this form, CORS currently provides the following four options for the entity type: 1, federal agency, 2, foreign entity, 3, private sector, or 4, state or local agency. The FCC is currently in the process of adding a 5th entity type, tribal entity, as an option. When a user in the broadband data collection system indicates that it is submitting data on behalf of a tribal governmental entity or state or local agency, the system will validate this selection against the CORS entity type associated with the filer's FRN. If the FRN has not been associated with the tribal government entity type in CORS, then the user will be given an error message and prompted to return to CORS to make that association. The purported tribal governmental entity will not be able to continue with submitting verified availability data in the broadband data collection system until making the required selection in CORS. We believe that this system will place minimal burdens on tribal governmental entities seeking to file verified broadband availability data in the broadband data collection system, while simultaneously allowing the Commission to verify the identity of the filers so that it may treat these data as, quote, verified as directed in the Broadband Data Act. You can find more information about the CORS system, including frequently asked questions and video tutorials for navigating CORS, at the web address provided on this slide. The second aspect of identity authentication is that we must also ensure that a filer is a governmental entity that is primarily responsible for mapping or tracking broadband internet access service coverage. As noted earlier, the Commission adopted rules in January for how it will evaluate the credibility of verified data submitted by governmental entities. We will ask 2 questions when evaluating such data. First, are the data submitted by an entity that specializes in gathering and/or analyzing broadband availability data? And second, is the submitter able to demonstrate that it, or the entity acting on its behalf, has employed a sound and reliable methodology in collecting, organizing, and verifying the availability data it is submitting? We anticipate that for many tribes and other governmental organizations, a single entity will specialize in gathering and analyzing broadband availability data within the jurisdiction. If a tribe has not yet identified an entity within its organization that will fulfill this role, or a contractor that will act on behalf of its organization, then we would encourage leadership to begin thinking about a single entity that can act on behalf of the tribe for this part of the broadband data collection. However, we also understand that in some cases, governmental structures and responsibilities may vary, and therefore multiple entities within the same jurisdiction may be tasked with mapping and tracking broadband coverage. In those cases, we would note that where availability data between and among competing entities conflicts, such that a service provider disagrees with the governmental submissions and declines to update its own data accordingly, the governmental entity or entities would then need to submit their data as part of a challenge to the provider's availability data via the challenge portal. To the extent multiple overlapping governmental entities, including tribal governmental entities, are able to coordinate their data submissions, this could prevent the service provider from raising objections to the validity of these data based upon potential mismatched or conflicting data sets. We would likewise look to intergovernmental organizations to coordinate with the individual tribal governments within their regions in the event of overlapping submissions. This concludes the first topic we will cover during the technical assistance portion of today's workshop, so I'll pass it back to Jean.
Sorry, had to unmute myself. Thanks, Sean. I think what we'll do now is take a brief break and reconvene at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Thank you. Officer on the Broadband Data Task Force to get us started on the second technical assistant topic in today's workshop. Chelsea?
Thank you, Jean, and hello, everyone. I'm Chelsea Fallon, the Senior Implementation Officer on the Broadband Data Task Force and Chief of the Data Division in the Office of Economics and Analytics. In the second portion of today's technical assistance presentation, we will cover the data specifications for the submission of primary broadband availability data. As Sean mentioned earlier, the Commission has indicated that it will treat primary availability data submitted by government entities, including tribes, as on par with the availability data submitted by providers. Because of this, the Commission decided that government entities submitting availability data must file it in the same portal and under the same parameters that providers must use when submitting their primary availability data. Similarly, all government entity filers will have to disclose the methodology they used to produce the primary availability data that they submit. I'm going to explain at a high level the types of data that we will collect as part of the broadband data collection. I also want to note that we plan to release documentation soon that will provide more information, including the specific data elements, the fields, the formatting requirements, and other specifications for these data. The task force will also host additional workshops in the future as we gear up for the full launch of the broadband data collection. We also will have other support resources, including a helpline you can call, and those will ensure that you have all of the information you need in a user-friendly format to be able to fully participate in the broadband data collection. I'm going to talk about reporting data on fixed broadband service first. So data on fixed broadband service can be submitted in one of two ways. First, filers may submit a list of locations that are currently connected to broadband or could be connected within 10 business days without the consumer incurring any special installation costs. Kirk mentioned earlier the broadband serviceable location fabric. And once the fabric is created, each location in it will have a unique identifier, as well as geographic coordinates and, where available, an address associated with it. And filers should use the fabric locations as the basis for generating the list of locations they file as part of the broadband data collection. Alternatively, if filers do not want to submit a list of locations served, they can create and submit a polygon map of the broadband service areas. These areas will then be overlaid on the fabric dataset to identify the locations that will be considered served by the provider. Terrestrial fixed wireless service can also be reported in two ways. First, filers can submit a list of locations served in the same manner as any provider of fixed broadband service, or filers of fixed wireless service may submit a coverage area polygon based on propagation modeling. Filers choosing this option must use standardized propagation model parameters and disclose information on base stations, antennas, link budget parameters, and clutter categories used in the modeling. For any reporting of fixed broadband service, in addition to the list of locations or coverage polygon, filers must include the name of the internet service provider, whether the service offered to a location or to an area is residential only, business only, or both, what type of network technology the ISP uses to offer broadband service, such as fiber, cable, or DSL, the maximum advertised download and upload speeds. However, if the maximum advertised download speed is below 25 megabits per second and the maximum advertised upload speed is below 3 megabits per second, then filers need only report whether the speeds they offer are either above or below 10 megabits per second download and 1 megabit per second upload. Finally, filers must include information on whether the latency of their service exceeds 100 milliseconds. In addition to these requirements, filers of information on fixed broadband service availability must submit information on the methodology they use to prepare their data. Filers must also make 2 certifications concerning their filings, and I think this came up in one of the questions earlier. So first, a corporate officer must submit a certification that the statements of fact contained in the filer's biannual submission are true and correct. Second, a certified professional engineer or corporate engineering officer must submit a certification that they have examined the information contained in the submission and that, to the best of the engineer's knowledge, information, and belief, all statements contained in the submission are true and correct and prepared in accordance with the service provider's ordinary course of network design and engineering. If a corporate officer is also an engineer and has the requisite knowledge, a filer may submit a single certification to fulfill both requirements. Finally, filers of fixed wired broadband data must conform to the maximum buffers adopted by the Commission when they report their coverage footprints. These are specified distances that are unique to each technology between the centralized network facilities and the locations served. Now I'll turn to reporting of mobile broadband service. So mobile broadband availability data must be based on propagation modeling by technology and minimum speeds. Providers must submit data for each of their deployed technologies. For 4G LTE, filers report areas where consumers can expect to receive a minimum download speed of 5 megabits per second and a minimum upload speed of 1 megabit per second. For 5G, filers will report at 2 different speed thresholds. First, areas where users can expect to receive a minimum download speed of 7 megabits per second and a minimum upload speed of 1 megabit per second. Second, they must report areas where users can expect to receive a minimum download speed of 35 megabits per second and a minimum upload speed of 3 megabits per second. Finally, for 3G, filers' maps must show areas where users can expect to receive a minimum user download speed of 200 kilobits per second and an upload speed of 50 kilobits per second. All of these maps must be based on the additional propagation modeling parameters of a 90% probability of the speeds mentioned at the cell edge and a 50% cell loading factor. These standardized propagation model parameters will allow the FCC and the public to make apples-to-apples comparisons of mobile broadband coverage. For each of the technology and speed thresholds that I mentioned, providers will be required to submit 2 sets of maps. The first will show where the model predicts that users should expect to receive the relevant speeds while riding in a moving vehicle. The second will show where users should expect to receive the relevant speeds in a stationary outdoor environment. When filing their mobile broadband availability data, filers must submit the various maps I mentioned as polygons in a specified GIS file format. These GIS files must include certain information, including the name of the mobile broadband service provider, the network technology used to deliver the service, the minimum download and upload speeds associated with the coverage, and the minimum signal strength that users can expect to receive. Filers also must disclose information on the propagation model they used, their link budget parameters, and the clutter categories used in the model. The FCC may use this information to verify the model coverage. This covers the relevant data, the relevant types of broadband data that the FCC will collect as part of the BDC. Thank you for joining us today. Now I will pass it back to Jean for questions.
Thanks, Chelsea. I know we've covered a lot of information, some of it quite technical. So we'll have time now to answer any more questions that you might have about either the process for identity authentication, in the BDC system, or data specifications that will be required for primary availability submissions. In the same way that you've been doing, please use the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many of these as we can. And since we cut off the question and answers in the first portion, please don't hesitate to answer questions about Kirk's more general background information. I'll turn it over to John Cobb again to try to direct some of the questions.
Absolutely. So I know that this has come in a couple times, and since Chelsea just discussed it, and we sort of touched on it earlier, some folks have asked about what are the qualifications for someone, what sort of qualifications or certifications are we looking for certified engineers? There's lots of different certifications that engineers can get. So I think I'm going to pass that one to Sean.
Thanks, John. So there's a section of the third report and order, particularly paragraphs 42 through 46, that discuss this engineering certification requirement, or I believe the certification requirements generally, both the corporate officer and the engineering certifications. And the relevant rule is 1.7004D, I believe. Most of it speaks to a certified professional engineer or corporate engineering officer. But there's also reference to a qualified engineer in both the rule and the third report and order. So I may ask Chelsea to keep me honest here, but I think kind of the crux of that is, we are really looking to the qualifications of the engineer to be able to certify to the actual substantive requirements under the rule, the knowledge of the network design. And I think it's less of a focus on the degree or specific accreditation of the certifying individual.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, the rules and requirements don't get into specific degree qualifications, but someone who is a professional engineer with the certifications that allow them to make the certification about the accuracy of the data.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean and Chelsea. Shifting topics a little bit, we got a question about tribal governments who wear two hats, who are both the tribal government and a registered service provider. So I was wondering, I'm going to pass that one to Kirk to discuss, what should tribes in that sort of situation be doing, how they should be thinking about these reporting requirements.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it's important to see the distinction. There's two obligations. So as a provider, you are required to report on your own deployment on twice annually. The third party verified data option is just that. It's not a requirement. If you have information that you want to provide to us, it's strictly optional. It doesn't need to pertain to you. If you also happen to be a provider, it doesn't necessarily have to be your information or to be limited to your information. But you should have some, I think we anticipate that will come from entities who engage in mapping that have direct knowledge of the circumstances that they're providing data on. So it's a much more open option in the sense that we would take information about other all providers deployment information, which is a distinct avenue and an optional avenue as compared to the obligations that providers have to report their deployment.
Great, thank you so much, Kirk. Jean, we got a question about whether there's a separate TTA provider or if they're going to work directly with our staff on questions.
Thanks, John. Yes, we are in the process. We have under the statute, we are required to provide technical assistance not only to tribal entities, but also to state and local governments, providers, and consumers. And so we are in the process of contracting for some support for us to help us staff up those kinds of resources for all of those groups. And we're working on that, and we expect to have that out by the time we go live with the collection beginning. But in the meantime, we also have resources on staff that can help with questions as you start to think about the collection and what needs to be submitted and what kinds of filings you may want to be making. And you can email both the Broadband Data Task Force or the Office of Native Affairs and Policy. The Broadband Data Task Force inquiry number or email address is broadbanddatainquiries@fcc.gov. That's broadband data inquiries, all one word, at fcc.gov. And the Office of Native Affairs and Policy is native@fcc.gov. We'll also be putting out public notices when our separate support tribal assistance help desks are available.
Great, thank you so much, Jean. So we have a question asking what is the oversubscribed rate? I think we would like a little extra clarification on that. So if you want to elaborate on your question, Chris, in the chat box, I'll circle back to that in a minute. In the meantime, we've gotten several questions about latency and where it's measured to and from. I think I'll pass that one over to Chelsea.
Sure. So the latency reporting, just want to clarify, first of all, it only applies to the fixed broadband providers, and it is based on the network round trip latency that is associated with each of the reported maximum speed combinations, and that would be based on the 95th percentile of measurements. So that's the requirement, and then the providers would report just whether that number is below 100 milliseconds or whether it's above that for each area that they cover or for each location.
Great, thank you so much, Chelsea. All right, so I see Chris is asking about the oversubscribe rate for users to direct internet access. I'm not sure that Jean, do you want to?
Yeah, I think that's when we're having a little bit of terminology disconnect here, and it might be better, I think, for the questioner for that particular question to give a call to the task force, and maybe we could talk about it and figure out quite what the question is and be able to answer it better. John, if you want to let them have a phone number for that, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll make sure that and we're going to follow up with everyone, we'll send you the links to everything as where we're posting. I'll make sure that we have my phone number available so you can reach out to us in that as well.
Great, thanks, John.
Yeah. I'm not sure that we have. Are there any other questions that are coming up? If anyone sees anything I have missed here in the question box, please speak up.
So seeing none, before we close, I'd like to recap a few considerations as you begin thinking about what's next and how tribes will be able to participate in the broadband data collection. Our technical assistance conversation today focused on just one way, submission of verified availability data. However, as the presenters have mentioned, tribal entities will also have the ability to submit data through the important broadband data collection challenge and crowdsource processes that Kirk outlined. Through the challenge process, tribes will be able to challenge the coverage data submitted by internet service providers as reflected in the BDC maps. You'll be able to submit challenges to coverage information for fixed service providers like wireline, telephone, and cable companies, and for mobile providers. Providers will be required to respond to challenges, and if they are unable to rebut the challenge, they will be required to update their data, and we will update the maps. Tribes will also be able to submit challenges to the broadband serviceable location fabric if it does not correctly identify broadband serviceable locations on tribal lands. Tribes will also have the option of submitting crowdsourced data. While unlike a challenge, crowdsourced data will not automatically require a review by the provider, FCC will use it to help identify whether there's a credible basis to require the provider to verify that its data is accurate and complete. Further, individual consumers, including tribal members, will also be able to participate in the challenge and crowdsourcing processes. And we'd encourage you to think about ways that you can help us to urge consumers on tribal lands to participate in this important process. One way would be to encourage residents on tribal lands to download the Fcc Speed Test App, which currently allows users to test their mobile broadband network speeds and delivers that data to the FCC as part of our Measuring Broadband America program. We are also in the process of adding additional functionality to the app so that individuals may submit speed test data as part of a mobile broadband challenge in the broadband data collection. The Fcc Speed Test App is available in the Google Play Store for Android devices and in the Apple App Store for iOS devices. You search FCC Speed Test in either store or use the links that we provide on our FCC website at www.fcc.gov/broadbanddata to find and download the app. Finally, today's workshop is only the first in what we anticipate will be several workshops as we implement the BDC, and we'll work with you as we review the need for continuing technical assistance workshops after that. Further, we're developing guides and establishing help desk services, as I mentioned earlier, for individuals and governments submitting data as part of the BDC, which will be available as a resource on an ongoing basis. I don't know, John, if there are any other questions that we can answer in the last minute or two that we have here that have come in, but if not, has anything come in, John? Don't see anything in the chat, in the Q&A. So with that, I think we'll bring today's workshop to a close. We thank you again for all participating in the workshop and hope you found it informative. As John said, we'll make a recording of this presentation available on our website. And again, that's at fcc.gov/broadbanddata. Thanks so much for attending. I'd also just like to say that I'd like to thank John and others at the FCC, Cecilia Solhoff and our IT and commission meeting room staff for helping us to put this together. This is the first time we've used WebEx for an FCC webinar, at least the Broadband Data Task Force, that is. So there were lots of kinks to get ironed out, and hopefully it's flowed fairly smoothly, and we'll be able to use it again. So thanks to all of them. So in conclusion, I just say we very much look forward to continuing the dialogue as the broadband data collection process becomes available, and even more importantly, I think, to working with you once the new collection starts to collect more precise and granular data on broadband deployment throughout tribal lands, so that we can deploy resources targeted to locations where a service is not available. In the meantime, again, if you have any other additional questions for us, please don't hesitate to reach out. to both the Office of Native Affairs and Policy or the Broadband Data Task Force at the email addresses shown on the slide. Thanks very much, and I guess this concludes the webinar for today.
Thank you.
Thanks.